The courthouse stood like a fortress of justice in the center of the small American town, its stone walls weathered by decades of trials, verdicts, and unspoken stories. On this particular morning, the air inside was thick with anticipation, heavier than usual, as though everyone present sensed something unusual was about to unfold. The trial had already drawn considerable attention. Neighbors, reporters, and even curious passers-by had crammed into the gallery, eager to witness the proceedings. Inside, the courtroom was still, the kind of silence that hummed in people's ears. The faint scratching of pens, the shuffling of papers, and the occasional cough were the only interruptions. Every sound seemed magnified in the cavernous room. The judge, a stern man with graying hair and a reputation for fairness, adjusted his glasses and scanned the packed benches. His eyes betrayed none of his thoughts, but deep down, he knew the trial teetered on fragile ground. At the prosecution's table sat District Attorney Harris, his brow furrowed with frustration. The case against the defendant, Michael Turner, a man accused of breaking into a family's home, was weak at best. Evidence existed, but it was circumstantial. A boot print near the broken window, a vague eyewitness account, and the terrified memories of a mother and her child. Harris had spent weeks preparing, but as the trial progressed, he sensed the jury's skepticism growing. Across from him, the defense attorney, Robert Kane, exuded confidence. Slick, sharp-tongued, and seasoned. In dismantling weak cases, Kane leaned casually in his chair, occasionally whispering to his client. Turner, a wiry man with hollow cheeks and a nervous twitch in his jaw, avoided everyone's eyes. He looked like someone with secrets, yet Kane painted him as a victim of mistaken identity, wrong place, wrong time. For now, the jury seemed inclined to believe it. In the gallery, whispers swirled like leaves in the wind. Most of the spectators had come not for the evidence, but for the curiosity of what would happen when a 3-year-old girl was called to the stand. Few believed she would speak. Some even questioned why a child so young was being brought into such a frightening environment. And yet, when the heavy wooden doors creaked open, every head turned. A young mother stepped forward, holding tightly to her daughter's small hand. The child was tiny, her brown hair tied back in pigtails, her dress simple and neat. She clutched a stuffed rabbit in one arm, her other hand buried in her mother's grasp. Her wide eyes scanned the room, unblinking, as though taking in the weight of every gaze upon her. The jurors leaned forward. The judge shifted slightly in his seat. The silence grew heavier still. At that very moment, in the corner of the room, a large German shepherd stirred. Max, the police K-9, had been assigned to sit in court as a measure of security and comfort for the child witness. Though some courts allowed therapy dogs, Max was no ordinary animal. He was a decorated police dog, trained in tracking, protection, and detecting danger. His presence, both calming and commanding, had already drawn whispers before the trial began. As the little girl entered, Max's ears perked. His amber eyes locked on her, following her every step. He did not bark, did not move, but the air seemed to change with the intensity of his gaze. The officer holding his leash glanced down at him, sensing the shift but trusting the dog's instincts. The girl's mother guided her to the witness stand. The child's tiny shoes clicked softly against the polished wood floor, each sound echoing in the hushed room. She climbed onto the seat with help, her small legs dangling nervously as she clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter. Her mother squeezed her shoulder reassuringly before stepping back. From his seat, Kane, the defense attorney, allowed himself a smirk. In his mind, this was a gift. A toddler on the stand? She wouldn't speak, or if she did, her words would be dismissed as unreliable. He leaned closer to Turner and whispered something that made the man's lips twitch into a crooked grin. District Attorney Harris, however, leaned forward with hope flickering in his tired eyes. This was his last card to play, the one witness who might break through the fog of doubt clouding the case. But he knew the risks. If the girl froze or said something confusing, the defense would twist it, and the case would collapse. The judge cleared his throat. "We'll proceed," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. The girl fidgeted, her eyes darting nervously toward the crowd. The weight of so many strangers watching was overwhelming for someone so small. Her mother, standing a few feet away, smiled encouragingly, mouthing the words, "It's okay." And then, as though seeking courage from somewhere beyond her mother's reach, the girl turned her head. Her eyes found Max. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, his gaze unwavering. The girl blinked, and for the first time since she entered, her grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened slightly. Her small hand reached out, pointing toward him. "Doggy," she whispered, her voice so soft that only those closest to her heard. The officer handling Max glanced at the judge, uncertain whether to intervene. But the judge, curious, simply nodded. To everyone's surprise, the girl slipped off the stand, toddling toward the corner where Max sat. The room collectively held its breath, unsure of what was unfolding. Even Kane raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering slightly. Max did not move. His body remained taut with alertness, but his eyes softened as the little girl approached. When she reached him, she dropped her stuffed rabbit and placed her small hand on his fur. The dog leaned his head slightly toward her, a quiet, subtle gesture of acceptance. A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. The prosecutor's heart raced. This was unexpected, but something told him it wasn't meaningless. The judge frowned, considering whether to call the child back, but then paused. Something about the scene felt significant, as though interrupting would break a moment no one yet understood. The girl bent down, her lips close to Max's ear, whispering words too quiet for anyone else to hear. The dog's ears twitched. His body stiffened for a moment, then relaxed. The defense attorney rolled his eyes and chuckled under his breath. "She's playing with a dog," he muttered, loud enough for the jurors to hear. Hardly evidence, but the jurors didn't laugh. They watched with rapt attention, sensing a connection forming between the child and the animal that couldn't easily be explained. The mother, tears forming in her eyes, clasped her hands together. She knew her daughter better than anyone. For months, the child had refused to speak of the night they were attacked. Not a word, not a description. Trauma had locked her voice away. Yet here she was, whispering to a dog in a crowded courtroom. The judge finally cleared his throat again. "Miss," he said gently, addressing the little girl, "would you please return to the stand?" Slowly, the child turned back. Her eyes lifted to the man sitting at the defense table. Turner's expression tightened, his jaw clenching as he avoided her stare. But the girl didn't flinch. She held his gaze for a long moment before walking back toward the witness stand. Max's eyes followed her, never blinking. The silence in the room deepened. Even those who had come expecting a dull day in court now sensed the current of something extraordinary. The girl had not yet spoken for the record, yet she had already shifted the atmosphere, bending it into something charged with anticipation. And though no one could yet guess what she would say, one truth had become clear. The smallest voice in the room might hold the greatest power. The courtroom, still buzzing from the girl's unexpected approach to Max, gradually settled back into tense quiet. The judge tapped his gavel once, his expression stern, though his eyes betrayed curiosity. He had seen thousands of cases in his long career, but rarely had a child's presence shifted the air like this. It was as though something invisible had been stirred, and everyone felt it. Yet beneath the surface of that shift lay a deeper problem. The case itself the hard, Cold facts remained frustratingly fragile. District Attorney Harris knew it better than anyone. He sat at the prosecution table, his notes spread neatly before him. His pen tapped rhythmically against the wood, betraying his anxiety. He had been practicing law for 15 years, building a reputation as a man who fought fiercely for victims. But this case gnawed at him. He had pieced together everything he could, yet he knew the defense had plenty of room to tear holes in his arguments. The crime had taken place months earlier, on a stormy night. A single mother had been home with her daughter, the same little girl, now clutching her stuffed rabbit on the witness stand when someone broke into their house. The mother described waking to the sound of glass shattering, her daughter screaming, and the sight of a man's shadow in the hallway. She called 911, and the intruder fled before police arrived. Michael Turner had been picked up 2 blocks away, running in the rain. His boots matched the size of the prints near the broken window. He had no alibi, no reason to be in the neighborhood. But beyond that, the case was thin. There were no fingerprints inside the house, no DNA left behind. The mother had caught only a fleeting glimpse of the man before he escaped. It was dark, she admitted on the stand. I thought it was him, but I can't be completely sure. That uncertainty had been all Kane, the defense attorney, needed. Reasonable doubt, Kane repeated to the jury during opening arguments, his voice smooth and confident. My client was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Running during a storm, yes, but running from a crime? No, the prosecution wants you to believe coincidence is guilt, but that is not justice. The jurors had nodded, some visibly swayed by his words. Harris had felt his stomach sink. Without something stronger, something irrefutable, the case might collapse before it truly began. And now, as the little girl sat before him, her eyes wide and uncertain, he felt the weight of all that rested on her tiny shoulders. Sweetheart, Harris said gently, leaning slightly forward, do you remember that night? The night when someone came into your home? The girl clutched her rabbit tighter, her small lips pressing into a thin line. Her mother shifted nervously in the gallery, willing her daughter to find the courage to speak. The silence stretched. Kane smirked and rose. Objection, Your Honor. We're badgering a toddler. This is not a reliable witness. The judge raised a hand. Overruled for now. Proceed carefully, Mr. Harris. Harris nodded. He softened his tone further. It's okay if you don't want to talk about it, he said. But if you do remember anything, even something very small, you can tell us. Anything you say is important. The girl's gaze flicked toward Max again. The dog sat steady. In the corner, his eyes fixed on her, his ears alert. It was almost as though he were encouraging her, silently reminding her she wasn't alone. She whispered something under her breath. Could you repeat that? Harris asked gently. Her voice wavered but grew slightly louder. Scary. The word echoed in the courtroom like a bell. Harris leaned forward. Yes, sweetheart. It was scary. Do you remember who scared you? The girl's eyes flicked again toward Turner. Sitting stiffly at the defense table, she didn't point. She didn't speak. But the shift in her gaze was unmistakable. The jurors noticed. Harris noticed. Even Kane noticed. And suddenly, the weak case felt a little stronger. Still, Kane wasn't about to let that moment pass unchallenged. He rose again, his tone sharp. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is nothing more than suggestion. The prosecution is planting ideas in the child's mind. Children are impressionable. You could tell her the boogeyman lives in this room, and she'd believe you. The judge considered, then looked to the girl. Miss, do you know the difference between telling the truth and telling a lie? He asked. The child nodded quickly. Can you tell me what happens if someone tells a lie? They get in trouble, she whispered. The judge nodded. That's right. And we need you to only tell the truth here, okay? Her small head bobbed again. Harris exhaled slowly, relieved at the judge's decision to let her testimony continue. But deep down, he knew one faint word and a nervous glance were not enough. He needed more. Still, the way she had looked at Turner Harris couldn't shake it. Children didn't fake that kind of fear. Meanwhile, Max remained locked onto the defendant, his posture rigid. The officer at his side shifted uncomfortably, tugging lightly at the leash. The dog didn't budge. The jurors exchanged glances, some clearly unsettled by the way the trained canine seemed to react only when the defendant was mentioned. It wasn't evidence, not in the legal sense. But it was something. Something powerful, something emotional. The defense sensed it too. Kane leaned down toward Turner, whispering harshly. Turner shifted in his chair, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the little girl, then quickly away. Harris caught it, that flicker of guilt, of discomfort. Jurors noticed too. And though it wasn't admissible as proof, body language often spoke louder than words. The prosecutor pressed on. "Sweetheart, when you were at home that night, did you see the person who came in?" Her little hands squeezed her rabbit so tight that its fabric stretched. Her lips trembled. She glanced at Max again. This time, she whispered something else too faint for most to hear. Harris leaned closer. "I'm sorry, could you say that again?" Her eyes filled with tears. She swallowed hard. Then, in the quietest but clearest voice, she said, "Bad man." The words hung in the air. Harris froze, his heart hammering. The jurors looked at one another, wide-eyed. Even the judge shifted in his seat. Kane sprang to his feet instantly. "Objection! Inadmissible. She's a frightened child, latching on to vague ideas. This is prejudice, not testimony." But Max, as though on cue, rose to his feet. His body tensed, his ears pointed forward, his eyes locked on Turner with an intensity that made several people in the gallery gasp. The officer tugged the leash again, but Max refused to look away. Turner paled, shifting nervously, his hands clenching the table in front of him. It was just a moment. A child's words. A dog's reaction. But in that fragile, unsteady case, it was a spark that might just ignite everything. And though Kane's voice thundered objections, though the judge's gavel pounded for order, one thing had become unmistakably clear. The tide of the trial was beginning to turn. The courtroom still buzzed with the echoes of the little girl's faint but powerful words. Bad man. 2 syllables that had sliced through weeks of tedious testimony and endless objections. For District Attorney Harris, it was the first flicker of real hope. For Robert Kane, the defense attorney, it was a dangerous complication he had to neutralize. For the jury, it was a moment they couldn't shake from their minds. But for the little girl herself, the weight of the courtroom faded. As her attention settled once again on Max, the German shepherd in the corner. She had seen him the moment she walked in. Something about his presence calmed her, even though she had barely spoken a word since the night of the break-in. In her world of silence and nightmares, Max represented something safe, something solid. Now, with every pair of adult eyes on her, she turned away from the fear of the defendant and toward the one creature in the room who didn't frighten her. Her mother, seated just a few feet away, tensed as the girl's small body shifted. She knew her daughter well enough to recognize the signs she wasn't going to stay seated. Before anyone could stop her, the little girl slid off the witness stand. Her tiny shoes tapped against the wooden floor, each step echoing in the hushed chamber. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bailiff moved slightly forward, uncertain whether to intervene, but the judge raised a hand. His stern face softened just a fraction. "Let's see where this goes," he murmured. Max remained perfectly still as she approached. His ears perked forward, his head tilting ever so slightly, but his body didn't shift. He was trained to stay steady, no matter the distraction. Yet inside, something stirred. His instincts told him this child was important. The little girl stopped directly in front of him. She looked up, her wide brown eyes locking onto his amber gaze. Then, with a small movement, she dropped her stuffed rabbit onto the floor and reached out, her tiny palm pressing against the thick fur of his neck. The courtroom collectively held its breath. Max leaned his head slightly toward her, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of trust. He didn't lick, didn't nudge, didn't break his stance. But he allowed the contact, and in that moment, a silent bond seemed to form between the child and the dog. The jurors shifted, some with tears brimming in their eyes, even hardened. Officers in the back row exchanged glances. There was something profoundly human about the scene, even though it involved no words, only the quiet connection between innocence and loyalty. Kane, however, wasn't impressed. He leaned back in his chair with a dismissive smirk. "Your Honor," he said loudly, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "are we holding court today? Or a petting zoo?" Laughter flickered from a few in the gallery, but it was quickly silenced by the judge's glare. "Mr. Kane," the judge said firmly, "you'd be wise to keep your commentary to yourself." The smirk faltered, but Kane shrugged, pretending indifference. Inside, though, he seethed. The jury was eating this up. He could see it in their faces, the softening expressions, the empathy in their eyes. This wasn't just evidence anymore. It was emotion. And emotion won trials. The girl crouched, her lips moving as she whispered into Max's ear. No one could hear her words, but Max's ears twitched, his tail shifting slightly. Her mother covered her mouth with trembling fingers. For months, her daughter hadn't spoken more than a handful of words. To see her whispering, even if only to a dog, was almost too much to bear. The officer holding Max's leash looked to the judge for guidance. The judge nodded once, silently telling him to let the moment play out. When the girl stood again, she didn't look at her mother. She didn't look at the jury. She turned instead toward the defense table. Her eyes locked on Michael Turner. The man stiffened in his seat, his jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists on the table. He tried to hold her gaze, but within seconds, he looked away, his eyes darting to the floor. The effect on the jury was immediate. They saw it, his discomfort, his inability to face a child. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it felt like it. The girl took a small step closer to Turner, still clutching Max's fur. She didn't speak, but her tiny finger lifted, pointing straight at him. The silence was deafening. Turner's face drained of color. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "She's a child," Kane said, his voice louder than necessary. "Children point at strangers all the time. This means nothing." But his words rang hollow in the heavy air. Harris knew this was his chance. He rose slowly, his tone gentle as he addressed the girl. "Sweetheart," he said, "is that the man who scared you?" Her small voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes." The word sent a ripple through the courtroom. Turner slammed his hand on the table, the crack echoing like a gunshot. "She's lying," he barked, his voice harsh, desperate. The judge's gavel thundered. "Order! Mr. Turner, you will not address the witness directly." The outburst backfired instantly. The jury recoiled, some visibly disturbed by his sudden aggression. Kane grabbed his client's arm, hissing under his breath for him to sit down and keep quiet. Meanwhile, Max stood taller, his body tense, his gaze locked on Turner. A low rumble vibrated in his chest, not loud enough to be a growl, but enough for those nearby to hear. The officer tightened his grip on the leash, but Max's message was clear. He sensed the threat, and he wasn't backing down. The little girl, however, didn't flinch. Her hand remained steady on Max's neck. For the first time in months, she felt safe enough to stand her ground. Harris swallowed hard, struggling to steady his voice. "Your Honor," he said, "let the record show that the witness has identified the defendant." "Objection!" Kane thundered, his face red. "This is prejudicial, unreliable, and entirely inappropriate. She's 3 years old. This is not testimony, it's theatrics." The judge banged his gavel again. "Objection noted. The jury will decide what weight to give the statement." Kane collapsed back into his chair, furious. The girl finally stepped away from Max and returned to the stand, guided gently by the bailiff. Her mother exhaled, tears streaming freely. Now, the room buzzed with hushed whispers, the tension electric. Reporters scribbled frantically, sensing the headline that was writing itself. Child points at defendant, courtroom stunned. And as the jurors exchanged glances, it was clear that something irreversible had happened. The fragile case, once on the verge of collapse, had been given new life, not by hard evidence, but by the courage of a child and the steady presence of a dog. For Turner, it was the beginning of the end. For Harris, it was the first time in weeks he believed justice might be possible. And for the little girl, it was the moment her silence finally broke. The tide had turned, and everyone in that room knew it. The silence after the little girl's words clung to the walls of the courtroom like fog. Even the sound of the ceiling fan seemed too loud in the wake of her whispered yes. Every juror leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the child as if she had cracked open a truth no one else could touch. Michael Turner, the defendant, sat rigid in his chair. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the cool air. He drummed his fingers on the table, a restless rhythm that betrayed the storm raging inside. His lawyer, Robert Kane, kept whispering harshly into his ear, but Turner's eyes never left the child. For District Attorney Harris, this was the kind of moment prosecutors prayed for. A single word from a child had done what hours of cross-examination and endless exhibits could not. It had humanized the case. The jury wasn't just seeing evidence anymore. They were seeing fear. They were seeing innocence robbed. And innocence had just pointed a trembling finger at guilt. Still, Harris knew better than to get swept away. A child's testimony, especially a 3-year-old's, was fragile, easily dismantled if not handled carefully. He needed to strike the balance between allowing her courage to speak for itself and protecting her from Kane's inevitable attack. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "The court will take a short recess," he announced, his voice echoing in the charged room. "We will resume in 20 minutes. The gavel struck. The spell broke. Instantly, the courtroom erupted into noise. Reporters rushed toward the exits, their phones already buzzing with frantic calls. Spectators whispered furiously, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others clutching their chests as though they had witnessed something sacred. The little girl's mother hurried to her side, scooping her up in trembling arms. The child clung tightly, her small hand still holding the ear of her stuffed rabbit. But her gaze drifted back to Max, who sat at attention even as people shuffled past him. For her, he was the anchor in a sea of chaos. Max's handler, Officer Daniels, crouched beside the dog, resting a firm hand on his shoulder. "Good boy," he whispered. "Steady." Max's amber eyes never wavered from Turner. To him, the man radiated something foul, something that prickled against instincts honed through years of training. The dog didn't understand courtrooms or laws, but he understood danger. And everything in him said the little girl had been right. Turner rose abruptly, shoving his chair back so hard it screeched against the floor. His movements were sharp, almost violent. Kane grabbed his arm, trying to steady him, but Turner shook him off with a muttered curse. The bailiff's eyes narrowed, his hand brushing the edge of his holster, just in case. Outside the courtroom, the press swarmed like hornets. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, reporters shouted questions that no one answered. Harris slipped quietly through a side door, his thoughts already racing. He needed to prepare for what came next, because Kane wasn't going to let that moment with the girl stand unchallenged. Sure enough, back inside the defense chamber, Kane was pacing furiously. "You've ruined everything," he hissed at Turner. "Do you understand how bad that looked? Losing your temper in front of the jury? You might as well have stood up and confessed." Turner's jaw clenched. "She's 3 years old. They can't take her seriously." Kane stopped pacing, staring at him coldly. "Oh, they can. And they will unless I dismantle her testimony piece by piece. Which means when we go back in there, you keep your mouth shut. You don't look at her. You don't so much as breathe." "Wrong. Let me do my job." Turner muttered something under his breath, but this time he stayed seated, his fists tightening until his knuckles turned white. Meanwhile, in a quiet hallway, the girl's mother sat with her daughter on her lap, rocking her gently. Harris approached slowly, his expression softened. "She was very brave in there," he said quietly. The mother looked up, eyes glistening. "She hasn't spoken more than a handful of words since that night. I don't even know how she managed to say what she did." Her voice cracked. "She's just a baby." Harris crouched, meeting the little girl's eyes. She wasn't looking at him, though. Her gaze was locked on Max, who sat a few feet away, still and watchful. Harris followed her line of sight and nodded. "Sometimes it takes the right friend," he said, "and I think she's found hers." The little girl reached out a hand, her tiny fingers curling in Max's direction. The dog stood and padded over, lowering his head so she could touch him again. She buried her face into his fur, and for the first time in months, her mother heard the faintest sound of a giggle. It was fleeting, but it was there. The mother's tears spilled freely now, but they weren't only tears of fear, they were tears of hope. Back in the courtroom, 20 minutes slipped away too quickly. The gavel struck once more, and silence fell again as everyone returned to their places. Kane rose immediately, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp as blades. "Your Honor," he began, "the prosecution has just paraded a traumatized toddler in front of the jury and used a dog to manipulate emotions. This is not evidence, it's theater. I intend to cross-examine the child properly to demonstrate just how unreliable her so-called testimony really is." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The mother stiffened, clutching her daughter tighter. Harris's jaw tightened, but he said nothing yet. The judge's face was unreadable. "Proceed carefully, Mr. Kane. This is a child, not a seasoned witness. I will not tolerate badgering." Kane nodded smoothly. "Of course, Your Honor." The little girl was led back to the stand, her small hands gripping her rabbit. Max remained seated at the edge of the room, Daniels keeping him steady. But the dog's gaze never strayed far. Kane approached slowly, a practiced smile plastered across his face. "Hello there," he said, crouching slightly as though he were addressing his own niece. "You know my name, don't you?" "I'm Mr. Kane, and I just want to ask you a couple of easy questions. Can you help me?" The girl said nothing. She clutched the rabbit tighter. Kane tilted his head. "You like dogs, don't you? That's Max over there, isn't it?" Still nothing. The jurors shifted, already uneasy with the way Kane's voice carried a faint edge beneath its sweetness. Kane's smile thinned. "No, you said earlier that man over there," he gestured toward Turner, "was the one who scared you. But sweetie, you don't really know what you saw that night, do you? You were tired, it was dark, and sometimes children imagine things. Isn't that right?" Her eyes flicked to Turner for a second, then back to Max. Kane pressed harder, his tone just a bit sharper. Maybe you were just pointing because someone told you to. Maybe Mommy said that was the bad man. Did Mommy tell you to say that? The mother gasped, half rising from her seat, but the judge's gavel stopped her. The little girl's lips trembled. For a moment, Kane thought he had her. Then Max shifted. Not much, just the faintest movement, a small tilt of his head, and a low exhale. The girl's eyes went back to him. She straightened slightly in her seat, and in the softest voice, barely more than a whisper, she said, "He hurt me." The courtroom froze. Kane's face blanched. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The judge leaned forward. "Repeat that, please." Her voice shook. "But—" She obeyed. "He hurt me." Every juror stiffened. Harris's chest tightened with a mix of sorrow and victory. Turner's face twisted with rage. And Max, steady as stone, remained her silent guardian. In that instant, the case had shifted. Again this time, far beyond Kane's reach. The room felt as though it had stopped breathing. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the shuffling of papers from the stenographer, who was barely able to keep her fingers steady on the keys. The little girl sat upright in the witness chair, her tiny legs dangling inches above the floor, her stuffed rabbit tucked securely against her chest. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. She raised her small hand, and in that fragile yet fearless way only children could manage, she pointed toward Max. The German shepherd didn't move. His body was a statue, his amber eyes locked on her as if he already knew what was about to come. The child's finger drifted from Max to the man seated at the defense table. Turner froze. His pale lips twitched, his eyes darting as though searching for an escape route. And then, with a voice that cut through the silence like glass, she said two words. "Bad man." The impact was immediate. Gasps shot through the courtroom. Like gunfire. Someone in the gallery dropped a notebook, the sharp thud echoing. A juror's pen rolled off the desk, forgotten on the floor. Turner lurched back in his chair, his face draining of color. For a second, he looked less like a defendant and more like a cornered animal. His lawyer, Kane, reached for his arm, hissing at him to stay calm, but Turner yanked away, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. Judge Morrison slammed his gavel down once, the crack startling everyone back into stillness. "Order!" he barked, though even his voice trembled with the weight of the moment. The little girl didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply kept pointing, her chin lifted ever so slightly. "Bad man?" she repeated, louder this time. It was as though she had stepped out of her own fear, climbed beyond it. Her words were not the wild imaginings of a child. They were steady, deliberate, charged with the kind of truth that adults often tried to hide, but children had no choice but to speak. Harris, the prosecutor, felt his throat tighten. He had handled dozens of cases, some grueling, some heartbreaking, but never one that felt so raw, so unfiltered. He forced himself to stand, his voice calm, measured, though his heart hammered in his chest. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "I ask that the record reflect the witness has identified the defendant and described him in her own words." Kane shot up like a spring. "Objection." His voice cracked under the strain. "This is outrageous. The child is 3 years old. She cannot possibly grasp the meaning of what she's saying. This is manipulation. This is—" The judge cut him off sharply. "Sit down, Mr. Kane. Your objection is noted. Overruled." A murmur swept through the gallery, louder now, spilling past the judge's attempts to rein it in. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like fire on paper. Photographers outside the courtroom would soon be snapping the moment into headlines. And already, Whispers of "bad man" carried like echoes through the courthouse corridors. Turner slammed his palm against the table. "This is a setup," he roared, his voice cracked, raw and venomous. The jury recoiled. One woman covered her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. "Michael, stop!" Kane snapped, grabbing his client by the sleeve. But Turner was unraveling. He shoved the chair back and leaned forward, glaring at the girl. "You don't know what you're talking about, you little liar." The room erupted. The child shrank slightly, her small shoulders trembling, but Max was already on his feet. His body stiffened, ears erect, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. Daniels, the handler, held the leash tight, but Max didn't lunge. He didn't need to. The sound alone was enough to freeze Turner in place. Every pair of eyes in the room swung between the child, the dog, and the man who had just revealed more of himself in anger than months of legal proceedings ever could. Judge Morrison's gavel slammed down again and again, his face red with fury. "Order! Order in this court! Mr. Turner, one more outburst like that, and I will hold you in contempt." But the damage was already done. The jury had seen everything. They had seen the girl's fear. They had seen her gather the courage to name her monster. And they had seen that monster bare his teeth in response. The little girl lifted her chin once more, her voice clear. "Bad man." The words struck like a hammer, shattering whatever threads of doubt remained in the minds of those 12 jurors. Kane sank slowly into his chair, his face pale. He knew the case had just taken a devastating turn. Months of carefully constructed defense arguments, endless attempts to chip away at the prosecution's evidence. It had all been undone by 2 words, spoken by a child and confirmed by the instinctive growl of a dog. In the gallery, a woman wept openly. Another reached for her husband's hand. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, his normally stoic expression betraying the emotion of the moment. Harris took a step forward, his voice gentle now, almost reverent. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "can you tell us again? Who is the bad man?" The girl's hand shook, but she pointed firmly at Turner once more. "Him." The air cracked with tension, the weight of truth pressing down on everyone present. Max, still at her side, lowered his growl into silence. He didn't need to snarl anymore. His job was done. He had stood by her, steady and unyielding, until she found the strength to speak. Turner collapsed back into his chair, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and dread. His lawyer rubbed his temples, already calculating how much of the trial could be salvaged, but deep down, even Kane knew it was over. 2 words, that was all it took. 2 words from a child, backed by the steady presence of a dog, had pierced through the layers of lies, strategies, and denials. The judge took a long breath, his eyes heavy as he turned to the stenographer. "Let the record reflect," he said gravely, "that the witness has identified the defendant as the person who harmed her, using the words, 'bad man.'" Silence followed. Not disbelief, any more certainty. And as the gavel fell to adjourn for the day, no one doubted that the trial had changed forever. The courtroom was heavy with an almost tangible tension. The air hung thick, a mixture of fear, awe, and disbelief. Every head turned toward the little girl, but the silent force holding the room in its grip was Max, the German shepherd. His amber eyes never left the defendant, and though he said nothing, the courtroom understood. The dog had chosen sides, and his choice was unshakable. Michael Turner, seated stiffly at the defense table, tried to look composed, but it was an illusion. His pale fingers drummed nervously against the edge of the table, each tap a betraying signal of his inner panic. Kane leaned toward him, whispering instructions in a futile attempt to regain control. Turner's jaw twitched with barely suppressed rage, but his eyes kept flicking toward the child. The girl's small hand rested lightly on Max's head. She did not speak, but her gaze, wide and unwavering, communicated everything her tiny voice could not. Max, for his part, exuded calm authority. Every muscle in his body was poised, alert, yet he remained perfectly still. His presence alone radiated protection, a living shield for the little witness who had, in a matter of moments, changed the course of the trial. District Attorney Harris observed all of this with a mix of awe and strategy. The court had been a battlefield of words, legal maneuvers, and clever objections. But now, something far more primal had taken center stage. The child and the dog together spoke a truth beyond words, one that even the most seasoned lawyer could not refute. "Your Honor," Harris began, his voice steady but charged with emotion, "we ask that the court recognize the witness's statement and the circumstances surrounding it. While a child's words are often questioned, the unyielding presence of a trained canine in conjunction with her testimony provides a compelling context that cannot be ignored." Judge Morrison, a veteran of countless cases, allowed the statement to stand, though his eyes softened as he glanced toward the girl and Max. Even he could feel the weight of the moment, a silent acknowledgement that justice was more than procedure. It was truth recognized in its rawest form. Turner's face twisted in frustration. He could not deny what he had seen. His lips parted, and then he closed them again, realizing that any protest would make him appear even guiltier. Kane leaned over, whispering sharply, "Stay calm. Don't react." But the man could not help it. His shoulders tensed, his hands shook. Every movement betrayed the panic that had been building since the girl had uttered her two words. The jury, meanwhile, shifted uneasily. Weeks of deliberation, witness testimony, and evidence had built up, but now the case had been crystallized into something undeniable. The little girl's courage, coupled with Max's unspoken confirmation, transformed an otherwise fragile prosecution into a formidable force. They exchanged glances, some nodding imperceptibly to themselves. Doubts that had lingered were beginning to dissipate. Harris took a deep breath. He had to proceed carefully. "Sweetheart," he said gently, lowering his voice so that only she and Max could hear, "can you tell the court where the man was when he hurt you?" The child's tiny fingers clenched Max's fur. She looked up at the dog, then back at Turner. Slowly, deliberately, she whispered, "Hallway." The room froze. The mother's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Harris's heart pounded, and even the judge's hand paused mid-air. "Hallway," the girl repeated, louder this time. The jurors scribbled notes, leaning closer, trying to capture every word. Kane rose immediately. "Objection." Leading. "The witness. The prosecution is planting words in her mind." Judge Morrison banged his gavel, sustained in part. "But the witness may continue." The child's eyes never wavered. She pointed slightly toward Turner again. Max stepped subtly forward, a gentle shift that spoke volumes. It was a movement of assertion, not aggression, a silent endorsement of the child's account. The jury noticed. Every slight motion of the dog reinforced the truth of her words. Turner's face paled. For the first time, his arrogance seemed to crack. He swallowed hard, attempting to steady his breathing, but the tension was unbearable. Kane whispered urgently, "Ignore it. Do not respond." But Turner could not. He slumped in his chair, his hands clenching the table, jaw tight. He muttered, under his breath, "This is ridiculous." "A dog?" Max's ears twitched. His tail shifted slightly. Though subtle, it was enough. The officer holding the leash tightened his grip reflexively, aware that Max's instincts were finely tuned, and that this subtle movement spoke more truth than any witness could. Harris rose slowly, voice calm and authoritative. Your Honor, the witness has indicated the location of the incident. We request that this information be considered alongside her previous statements. Her courage, despite her age, and the dog's behavior together provide a clear context that is consistent with her testimony. Judge Morrison nodded, his expression solemn. Let the record reflect that the witness has provided consistent information regarding the location and nature of the incident, corroborated by observable reactions from a trained canine present in the courtroom. A murmur swept through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing the unprecedented scene. A child and a dog influencing a courtroom like a single force of truth. The little girl's mother wiped tears from her eyes. She could hardly believe what was unfolding. Her daughter had been silent for months, locked away by fear, and now she had spoken clearly, unflinchingly, naming the man who had harmed her. And Max, ever vigilant, had lent the quiet strength necessary for her to do so. Turner's face contorted. In fury, he attempted to speak, but Kane's sharp hand on his shoulder silenced him. Every attempt to regain composure failed. The jury could see the panic and guilt etched across his features. Harris leaned forward again. Can you tell us anything else, sweetheart? Did the man do anything else? The child shook her head. Her eyes returned to Max. She whispered again, almost inaudibly, but her lips moved with determination. No more. It was enough. The courtroom absorbed the moment, the bravery of a child, the silent guidance of a dog, and the unraveling of a guilty man. Max had communicated without words, confirming the girl's statements, providing a protective presence that allowed truth to surface. It was extraordinary, beyond legal precedent, but it was undeniable. Harris felt a swell of emotion. The case had been weak, circumstantial, and frustrating. But now, with the courage of a 3-year-old and the silent testimony of a dog, the scales had tipped. Justice, it seemed, had found its champions. Kane slumped back into his chair, silent, powerless. He could no longer spin the narrative. The child's 2 words, backed by Max's behavior, had spoken louder than any legal argument he could muster. Turner's shoulders sagged. He looked defeated, trapped by the undeniable truth laid bare before him. His attempts to hide behind fury had failed. Judge Morrison took a deep breath. The court will resume tomorrow, he announced. We have witnessed extraordinary testimony today, and I expect both sides to approach the proceedings with the seriousness required. The record will reflect the statements given by the witness and the observable reactions of the K9 present. The gavel fell, the sound reverberating like a drumbeat of finality. The little girl, exhausted but resolute, clung to her mother as they exited the courtroom. Max followed obediently, his amber eyes scanning the room one last time before the officer guided him gently away. Outside, reporters clamored for statements, but the mother remained protective, holding her daughter close. Harris stayed nearby, quietly reassuring her that the courtroom had witnessed the truth. And in the silent aftermath, one thing was clear. The power of innocence, courage, and unwavering loyalty had reshaped the trial. 2 words, bad man, had spoken louder than evidence, testimony, or argument. They had spoken truth. And Max, without ever speaking, had confirmed it. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind a heavy silence that hung over every seat, every polished wood surface, and every pair of eyes that had witnessed the extraordinary scene. Jurors filed out quietly, their faces solemn, whispering in low tones. None of them had ever seen anything like it: an infant's courage, a dog's instincts, and a man's unraveling combined into a moment that seemed to bend the very rules of logic. Michael Turner remained at the defense table, staring at the empty space where the child had just sat. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles whitening. He had been through stressful situations before, but nothing in his life had prepared him For this, Kane had told him to keep his composure, to stay quiet, but Turner's mind raced with visions of the little girl pointing, whispering, "Bad man," backed by the unwavering presence of Max. Even now, he could feel the judgmental weight of the jury's gaze, imagining them replaying the scene repeatedly in their minds. He wanted to speak, to deny, to lash out, but he couldn't. Every fiber of his being told him that any reaction would confirm what the child had already said. Outside the courtroom, the little girl clutched her mother's hand as they walked down the hall. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Max, still with Officer Daniels, walked beside them, his calm presence steadying her. Each step was a small victory for the child, a reclaiming of courage that had been stolen from her months ago. The press tried to follow, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, but her mother shielded her, whispering, "Not now." Today, the girl's eyes scanned the crowd for Max, and when she saw him, her lips curved into a small, tired smile. He nuzzled slightly against Danielle's hand, acknowledging the child's gaze. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Harris prepared for the next phase of the trial. He knew the prosecution had a fragile case, and while the child's words and Max's presence had created an extraordinary shift, the defense would still attempt to undermine her credibility. The law did not always recognize instinct or courage. Hard evidence was required. Yet, for the first time in weeks, Harris felt hope. He reviewed his notes, running through each detail of the child's account and the subtle but undeniable confirmation provided by Max. Every juror had noticed the dog's reaction, even if no one could articulate its legal relevance. Sometimes emotion spoke louder than logic, and Harris understood that completely. Kane, meanwhile, worked furiously to regain control. He gathered Turner in a small conference room off the main courtroom, leaning close and speaking sharply. "You have to stay calm, Michael. You cannot afford another outburst. Tomorrow, we'll challenge every word she said. We'll dissect her testimony, question her reliability, and remind the jury that she's just a 3-year-old. Children forget, children lie, children misinterpret. That's our path." Turner rubbed his temples, sweat beading on his forehead. "I can't stop thinking about that dog," he muttered, voice low and tense. "It was like it knew everything I did. Like it saw me. I can't." Kane's eyes narrowed. "Focus. You don't get to think about the dog. You follow my lead. Keep quiet. That's all you can do. Tomorrow, we fight in court." The next morning arrived with an almost unbearable tension. Jurors filed back in, their expressions careful, their notes clutched tightly in hands that trembled slightly. Reporters were locked in their booths, waiting for the session to resume. The gallery buzzed softly, a low hum of anticipation. The little girl entered again, holding her mother's hand. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She walked with quiet determination, her eyes briefly meeting Max's before focusing on the witness stand. The dog remained at attention, his presence almost ceremonial, a silent sentinel ready to respond if needed. Harris leaned down, whispering, "You're doing great." She nodded, clutching her rabbit tightly, the only link to a world that still felt safe. Kane rose once more, his expression polished, but his eyes betraying stress. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said smoothly, "let's remember that children are impressionable. They can be influenced, they can misinterpret events, and sometimes their memories are not reliable. Today, you have witnessed an emotional display, a child pointing and a dog reacting. But let us not forget, emotion is not evidence." Harris countered immediately, rising to his feet. "Your Honor, if I may." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Harris addressed the jury with calm authority. "What you have seen is not just a display of emotion. You have witnessed courage, clarity, and instinct. This child survived a terrifying event and is pointed to the person responsible. Max, the canine officer, has remained focused, alert, and protective, responding to a threat that only he can sense. Sometimes the truth comes in ways beyond paperwork or testimony. Sometimes it comes through courage and instinct. The jurors shifted in their seats, leaning forward, scribbling notes, absorbing every nuance. The child's words, supported by Max's silent reactions, were already shaping their understanding of the events. Turner's attempts to remain composed began to crumble. Each movement of the child, each subtle nod from Max, each whisper of "bad man," replayed in his mind. He clenched the table edge, muscles trembling, attempting to mask the panic that was spreading through him like wildfire. Kane whispered instructions, but Turner's internal panic made him stiff, unresponsive, tense. The judge paused the proceedings, briefly addressing the court. "We will now review the evidence as presented and continue with cross-examination." When Kane approached the child to question her again, the jurors noticed a shift. Turner's anxiety, the subtle tension in Kane's movements, and Max's steady watchfulness created a visual narrative that words could not match. The child's tiny voice, her quiet courage, and the dog's instinctive signals formed a compelling truth. She answered Kane's questions, her words halting but clear. Her answers were consistent. Her account matched her earlier statements. Her fear was palpable, but not exaggerated. Max's presence ensured that she felt safe enough to tell the truth. Harris could see the tide had firmly turned. The jury was leaning, emotionally and instinctively, toward her account. The defense's attempts to discredit her fell flat, weakened by the undeniable authenticity of her fear and the dog's nonverbal testimony. Finally, the session ended, and the courtroom slowly emptied. Jurors filed out, thoughtful, their conversations muted, but heavy with consideration. Reporters whispered, already drafting articles in their minds. Harris allowed himself a small, quiet exhale. Outside, the little girl hugged Max once more before returning to her mother's side. The dog nuzzled gently, a silent reassurance that she had done what no one else could. She had spoken, she had named the bad man, and she had been heard. Turner left with Kane in silence, his mind replaying the child's voice, the dog's amber eyes, and the helplessness he had felt under their scrutiny. He had tried to control the courtroom, tried to control the narrative, but truth had a force, stronger than anything he could manufacture. And in that force, the courage of a child, the loyalty of a dog, the jury had already begun to understand what had truly happened. The trial, once fragile and uncertain, now seemed inevitable. The end was approaching. The courtroom was tense with anticipation. After days of testimony, whispered revelations, and the silent testimony of Max, the jurors were ready to deliberate. The air felt thick, every heartbeat amplified in the hushed room. The little girl clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly, her small hand brushing Max's fur for reassurance. The dog, steady and vigilant, seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. District Attorney Harris stood quietly, reviewing his notes one last time. He had prepared meticulously, but even he couldn't have predicted how a 3-year-old and a German Shepherd would dominate a courtroom. Yet here they were, a child's courage and a dog's instinct shaping the course of justice. The judge's gavel struck, bringing everyone's attention to the front. "The jury has reached a verdict," he announced. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. A hush fell over the room. Reporters leaned forward, cameras flashing intermittently, capturing the moment. Every eye was on the jury as the foreperson rose, holding the slip of paper that would determine the fate of Michael Turner. Turner, pale and rigid, sat at the defense table, hands clenched tightly. His lawyer whispered reassurances he no longer heard. The man had been unraveling for days, haunted by the child's courage and the dog's unwavering presence. Each image, each whisper of bad man replayed in his mind, eroding his confidence and composure. The foreperson's voice trembled slightly as she read aloud. We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael Turner, guilty on all charges. The courtroom erupted in stunned silence for a split second. Then a wave of whispers and murmurs swept through the room. Some clutched their hearts, others wept quietly, and a few simply stared, trying to process the weight of what had just been. Confirmed. Turner's face went ashen, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Kane leaned forward, opening his mouth as if to protest, but the words died in his throat. There was nothing left to argue. The evidence, the testimony, and the undeniable courage of the little girl had spoken. The child's mother exhaled deeply, her arms tightening around her daughter. Tears streamed down her face, but there was relief in them, a lightness that hadn't existed in months. She glanced at Max, who stood patiently at her daughter's side, his head tilted slightly, as if to acknowledge that his part in this had not gone unnoticed. Max had been more than a witness. He had been a protector, a silent enforcer of truth. He had sensed danger when the child couldn't articulate it, had provided calm and security while she faced her worst fears. And now, the man who had caused her harm would pay for his crimes. Turner's hands trembled as the bailiff stepped forward to escort him from the courtroom. He shot a glance at the little girl, but she didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on Max, steady and unwavering, a silent testament to the truth she had spoken and the protection she had received. The courtroom slowly began to empty. Reporters pushed forward, capturing final images, recording reactions, and scribbling hurried notes. Harris allowed himself a quiet smile, though he remained composed. He had seen justice carried out in unexpected ways, and this was one of the most extraordinary moments of his career. Outside the courtroom, the press swarmed, eager to capture statements from the mother and her daughter. She held the child close, speaking softly to reporters, her words measured yet brimming with emotion. My daughter was brave today. She faced what she feared most, and she spoke the truth. Max, he helped her find that courage. Harris crouched beside them, glancing at the little girl. You were amazing, he whispered. You helped everyone see the truth. She nodded, a small, shy smile tugging at her lips. Max nudged her gently, a silent affirmation that she had done exactly what was needed. The jury had made its decision, but the courtroom itself seemed to carry a different weight, the kind of quiet reverence that comes from witnessing courage and truth collide in a way that transcends the ordinary. Everyone present, from officers to reporters, from jurors to courtroom staff, had been touched by the sheer bravery of a 3-year-old child and the loyalty of a dog who refused to back down. Even Kane, usually unshakable, sat in stunned silence. He had tried every tactic. To undermine the testimony, to discredit the child, to sow doubt in the jury's mind, but nothing could erase what had happened. The truth, when paired with courage and instinct, had prevailed. As Turner was led away, his face pale and defeated, the little girl finally released her grip on Max. She stepped back slightly, her tiny hand brushing the dog's head one last time. Max lowered his gaze, his amber eyes soft, almost tender. He had done his job. His presence had allowed a child to reclaim her voice and confront the darkness she had endured. The mother knelt beside her daughter, hugging her tightly. You did it, sweetheart. You were so brave. The girl clutched her rabbit and whispered something small, almost inaudible. Max helped. The words were simple, but they carried profound meaning. Max had not only protected her physically, but had given her the courage to face a man whose actions had terrified her. In that moment, the bond between child and dog became unbreakable, a silent testament to the power of trust, loyalty, and instinct. Later, as the courthouse emptied and the city streets hummed with life outside, Harris walked past the reporters, the jurors, and the courtroom staff. He paused briefly at the empty witness stand, glancing at the small chair where the little girl had sat. She had been the hero in a case that could have been easily derailed, and her bravery had inspired everyone who witnessed it. Max remained at the courthouse steps with Officer Daniels, tail swishing gently, as he observed the comings and goings of people who had no idea of the extraordinary role he had played. Children playing outside, people hurrying past, reporters snapping photos, all oblivious to the silent hero who had helped deliver justice. For the little girl and her mother, it was a moment of closure, though the emotional scars of the past months would take time to heal. But the power of truth, courage, and loyalty had made an indelible mark. She had faced fear, named it, and survived, and the world had listened. Turner would spend years paying for his crimes, but the lasting legacy of the trial was not in punishment alone. It was in the quiet affirmation that courage, no matter the age, and loyalty, no matter the species, could change the course of events in ways adults often underestimated. And as the little girl hugged her mother one final time that day, glancing at Max with a smile of trust and gratitude, it became clear to everyone watching that heroes come in all forms. Sometimes they wear badges, sometimes they wield words, and sometimes they simply have fur, 4 paws, and an unshakable instinct to protect the innocent. For the child, the courtroom had transformed from a place of fear to a place of triumph. For Max, it had been a mission completed. For the jurors and everyone else who had borne witness, it was an unforgettable lesson in courage, instinct, and the unexpected ways justice can be delivered. As the courthouse doors closed behind the departing crowd, one thought lingered in the air, almost unspoken, but universally understood. No one expected a 3-year-old and a dog to carry the day. But somehow, against all odds, they had. The story of that trial, the courage of a child, and the loyalty of a dog would be remembered long after the gavel fell, a testament to the idea that truth can speak in any voice. And sometimes, the smallest voices speak the loudest. And in the quiet aftermath, Max rested his head on his paws, amber eyes soft and content, having silently helped the world understand what bravery truly meant. The little girl's whispered words, "Bad man," would echo for years, not just as a testimony of guilt, but as a symbol of courage, hope, and the extraordinary power of innocence, paired with unwavering loyalty.